Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren, und herzlich willkommen zurück. Es ist kaum zu glauben, aber das ist die 29. Lektion. Das heißt, diese ist die vorletzte Lektion in unserer Reise durch die deutsche Sprache. Ach, wie die Zeit verfliegt. Darüber hinaus erleben wir hier keine gewöhnliche Lektion. Nein, 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 auf keinen Fall. For this, our penultimate lesson, we are, once again, going to be joining Herr und Frau Gruber as they explore 2 more locations in the German-speaking world. This time, we'll be traveling with them to Eastern Germany. First, we'll be going to the state of Saxony-Anhalt, auf Deutsch Sachsen-Anhalt, for a tour of Wittenberg, a city that dates back to the 12th century. After Wittenberg, we'll trek 100 kilometers further to the north and east to die Landeshauptstadt, Berlin. As we'll see, there is no end to the number of things to see and do in this culturally rich metropolis of over 3.5 million people, especially if you're interested in its turbulent and at times downright troubling past. Ja, so ist es, meine Damen und Herren. Die Geschichte der Stadt Berlin ist ähnlich wie die Geschichte von vielen Großstädten in Europa. Schwierig, aber vielschichtig. But more about that in a little bit. Right now, I suggest that we jump right in and listen as Ralph and Mia discuss their travel plans. As you're listening and reading along, I'd like you to keep an eye out for 2 grammatical aspects in particular. First, how Ralph and Mia use the subjunctive mood, and second, how they use the verb werden. Also dann, und jetzt, zu den Grubers!
Ich finde es toll, dass wir endlich eine Reise in den Osten machen.
Ja, ich wollte schon immer mal die Stadt Wittenberg sehen.
Martin Luther hat dort gewohnt, oder?
Richtig, der offizielle Name der Stadt ist eigentlich Lutherstadt Wittenberg.
Gut, wir fahren nach Wittenberg. Aber dürfte ich einen Vorschlag machen?
Natürlich.
Wir fahren mit dem Auto.
Auf der Autobahn?
Ja, wir nehmen die A9. Es geht praktisch geradeaus von Ingolstadt nach Wittenberg.
Stimmt, das wird höchstens 5 oder 5,5 Stunden brauchen. Ja, ich finde das eine gute Idee.
Und Berlin ist nur 1 Stunde weiter.
Echt? Naja.
Ralf, würdest du mich auch nach Berlin fahren?
Für meine Prinzessin alles. Also dann, die Reise ist geplant. Zuerst nach Wittenberg und dann nach Berlin.
Toll, du wirst es nicht bereuen. Das wird eine unvergessliche Reise werden.
Haben Sie das gehört? Die Grubers machen eine Reise mit dem Auto. They're going to take the Bundesautobahn, as it's officially called, or die BAB for short. Now, most of us have heard about the famous German Autobahn, where, supposedly, there are no speed limits, no police with radar guns, and where Mercedes race Porsches down the highway at ungodly speeds and past the rest of us slowpokes in our Volvo wagons who are only going 150 kilometers per hour. Or something to this effect, right? Well, unfortunately, this is only partly true. That part about no speed limits, for instance, yeah, it is true that more than half of the Autobahn's 13,000 kilometers of blacktop has no posted Geschwindigkeitsbegrenzung. Yes, this is a long and quite unwieldy word, which is why most Germans use the more colloquial term Tempolimit. Here's the real truth about die Autobahn. First, the federal government does maintain a general Richtgeschwindigkeit for all unposted stretches of highway. As of this taping, the Richtgeschwindigkeit is 130 kilometers per hour, or 81 miles per hour for my fellow Amerikaner und Amerikanerinnen. Nevertheless, this is still just a recommendation, and it's not really enforced. Second, a third of the Autobahn actually is regulated with an enforced tempo limit. For example, in urban areas where traffic can get heavy, and in spots that are particularly accident-prone, you'll find signs like these, and these signs, with the red circle, tell you that you're entering a zone with a zulässige Höchstgeschwindigkeit. And yes, meine Damen und Herren, there is such a thing as Verkehrspolizei. So if you're going 120 in a 90-Zone, don't be surprised if you see das Blaulicht in your rearview mirror. That said, and this is actually the most exciting part for some motorists, on those stretches of the Autobahn without a posted red circle Verkehrszeichen, you are, in fact, allowed to go as fast as the driving conditions safely allow. There are roughly 120 individual Autobahnen in Germany, all of them with an assigned number between A1 and A999. And for some drivers, it's faster to take the Autobahn than the train, especially if you're traveling from, say, Augsburg nach Wittenberg. Which brings us back to die Grubers. Let's home in now on those two grammatical points that I wanted you to keep an eye out for, namely, how the Grubers use the subjunctive mood and how they use the verb werden. For example, once Ralph and Mia agree on Wittenberg as their destination, Mia says, Gut, wir fahren nach Wittenberg. Now, it might seem like she's simply summing up or confirming their travel plans, but what she's really doing is setting up for her next comment, which is this. Dürfte ich einen Vorschlag machen? Now, one way to translate this comment would be, can I make a suggestion? But if you look closely, Mia is not using the modal verb können. Instead, she's using the subjunctive form of the modal verb dürften, namely, dürfte. Therefore, what she's literally saying to Ralph is, might I be allowed to, or would I be allowed to make a suggestion? But here's what's really going on with this utterance. Mia, you see, wants something, but she's linguistically smart about how she asks for it. Instead of just saying, darf ich einen Vorschlag machen? She pads her request with extra politeness. And she does this by using the subjunctive mood. Dürfte ich einen Vorschlag machen? In fact, later in their conversation, Mia uses the subjunctive in a similar way when she approaches the rather delicate matter of asking Ralph to take her farther north to Berlin. She knows that it's an hour's drive from Wittenberg, and she's not entirely sure how Ralph will react to her request. So instead of asking him, fährst du mich auch nach Berlin? Which comes across as a little bit forward, Mia frames her request in the subjunctive. Würdest du mich auch nach Berlin fahren? Now her request has a less direct or forceful ring to it. Alles klar? This, meine Damen und Herren, is another use of the present tense subjunctive. Speakers use it to express Höflichkeit or to temper the directness of a request. Zum Beispiel, imagine that we're sitting at a dinner table with a group of highly respected people, but people that we're also meeting for the first time. So in a situation like this, of course, we'll want to be on our best behavior, right? And so instead of saying things like, reichen Sie mir den Salz, or was empfehlen Sie, we say, könnten Sie mir den Salz reichen? Or würden Sie mir den Salz reichen? And was würden Sie mir empfehlen? Another situation where we'd want to use the polite subjunctive instead of the more direct-sounding indicative is in the customer service industry. For instance, whenever I'm at a deli counter in a German supermarket, I usually say something like this. Könnten Sie mir 100 Gramm Putenbrust geben? Würden Sie mir bitte 200 Gramm Schinken geben? Or even, ich hätte gern 150 Gramm Salami. These are all more polite ways of saying something like, geben Sie mir Putenbrust or geben Sie mir Salami. Alles klar? Gut. So much for the subjunctive of politeness. Also dann, do you remember the second grammatical item that I wanted you to watch out for? Richtig. How Ralph and Mia use the verb werden. Now, you might recall that we've already learned the following about the verb werden. 1. As a main verb, it means to become. 2. Its conjugation is irregular in the present tense. 3. It's a strong verb and takes sein as a helping verb in the present perfect. And 4. It's used together with a past participle to form the passive voice. Well, as we can see from Ralph and Mia's dialogue, speakers also use werden to express something else, namely the future tense. Consider Ralph's statement about how long it will take him and Mia to drive to Wittenberg on the Autobahn. Das wird höchstens 5 oder 5,5 Stunden brauchen. What Ralph is saying here is that it will take at most 5 or 5.5 hours. In other words, Ralph is expressing the action of taking time in the future tense. And to do this, he uses werden as an auxiliary verb, and he places the main verb brauchen at the end of the sentence. Mia also uses werden in this same way. At the end of the dialogue, for instance, after Ralph agrees to drive that extra hour north so that they can visit Berlin, she promises him this: Du wirst es nicht bereuen, because das wird eine unvergessliche Reise sein. Once again, notice that werden essentially functions like a modal verb. It's conjugated with the subject, and the main verb that it modifies, whether bereuen, sein, or any other main verb, the main verb stays in its infinitive form and comes in sentence final position. Du wirst es nicht bereuen. Das wird eine unvergessliche Reise sein. Now, if you're thinking, really, Professor Frem? That's it? That's how easy it is to form the future tense in German? Na ja, to that I say, yes, yes it is. Oder auf Deutsch, ja, so ist es. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, it's now time to catch up with Ralph und Mia. By now they've made their way via the Autobahn north from Augsburg in Bayern to the town of Wittenberg in Sachsen-Anhalt. Let's join them now as they visit one of the most famous historical sites that Wittenberg has to offer, the church where Martin Luther is said to have nailed up his world-changing 95 Theses. And as we listen and read along, as Mia and Ralph discuss this famous Schlosskirche and Luther's 95 Thesen, let's pay special attention to how they express events in the past tense. In particular, let's keep an eye out for the helping verbs they use when they talk about things that did happen in the past, as opposed to things that would have or might have happened. Alles klar? Also dann, los geht's nach Wittenberg.
Ist das die Schlosskirche?
Ja, hier hat Martin Luther seine Thesen angeschlagen.
Und wo ist die berühmte Kirchentür?
Ich glaube, sie ist dort drüben. Komm, wir schauen sie uns an. Das ist sie, die berühmte Thesentür.
Schön, sie ist aus Bronze.
Richtig, und sie enthält den ganzen Text von Luthers Thesen.
Diese ist nicht die originale Kirchentür, oder?
Nein, die ursprüngliche Tür war aus Holz und wurde in einem Brand zerstört.
Schade. Und wie viele Thesen waren es?
95.
Naja, er hatte bestimmt viel zu sagen.
Ja, und damals war es gefährlich, öffentlich gegen die katholische Kirche zu sprechen.
Was hättest du gemacht, wenn du damals Priester gewesen wärst?
Ich? Naja, ganz ehrlich, ich hätte wahrscheinlich keine 95 Thesen geschrieben.
Echt? Du hättest einfach den Mund gehalten?
Leider, ich hätte zu viel Angst gehabt.
Mach dir keine Vorwürfe. Ich weiß selber nicht, was ich gemacht hätte.
Wow, did you catch that interesting bit of history about the main door on the Schlosskirche? The door is called die Thesentür. It's made of bronze and it's imprinted with the entire text of Luther's 95 Theses. The original door, which was made of wood, and where Luther is said to have nailed the original document, that door was sadly destroyed in a fire. Die ursprüngliche Kirchentür wurde im Brand zerstört. By the way, that was a past tense passive construction that I just used. But you caught that, right? Natürlich, because we learned this in our last lesson, nicht wahr? Now, what is new for us, however, are the grammatical constructions that Mia and Ralph use when their dialogue turns from facts to hypotheticals. Did you happen to notice where this shift happens? Genau. It's when Mia asks Ralph, was hättest du gemacht, wenn du damals Priester gewesen wärst? Nun, you'll recall that in our last lesson, we learned that German has a specific grammatical mood for expressing what-if content, which is, richtig, the subjunctive mood. Auf Deutsch, der Konjunktiv. Furthermore, we learned that there are two ways of forming the Konjunktiv. One, using würden like a modal verb and putting the main verb in sentence final position. Or two, deriving a single word subjunctive form, especially for the verbs haben, sein, geben, and wissen, and for the modal verbs. But what we didn't cover in the last lesson, and which we're going to look at right now, is how to express hypothetical and contrary to fact content in the past tense. Which brings us back to Mia's what-if question to Ralph. Was hättest du gemacht, wenn du damals Priester gewesen wärst? Now, although the grammatical name for it sounds complicated, the past tense of the subjunctive mood, it's actually pretty easy to do. Promise. Meine Damen und Herren, to construct the past tense of the subjunctive mood, all you do is this. You formulate the sentence just as you would if it were in the present perfect tense. But instead of having an indicative form of haben and sein as your helping verb, you use the subjunctive forms, hätten and wären. For example, when Ralph und Mia are standing before the famous Wittenberg Schlosskirche, Ralph tells Mia, hier hat Martin Luther seine Thesen angeschlagen. Note that Ralph is expressing this historical event as a fact. He uses the indicative to express, this event that I'm talking about really happened. But let's imagine that Martin Luther didn't post his theses on the Kirchentür. In fact, let's imagine that he didn't even live in Wittenberg. Speaking hypothetically then, Ralph would say, hier hätte Martin Luther seine Thesen angeschlagen, wenn in Wittenberg gewohnt hätte. In other words, here's where Martin Luther would have posted his theses if he had lived in Wittenberg. Nun, this hypothetical past tense example is only for the purposes of showing us how the grammar works, because, in fact, Martin Luther did live in Wittenberg, and according to some contemporary accounts, he did post his theses on the door of the Schlosskirche. This is why Ralph talks about these events in the indicative and not in the subjunctive. So then, how about this? Let's look at some places in their conversation where Ralph and Mia do use the subjunctive to express what-if scenarios in the past tense. For instance, there's Ralph's response to Mia's hypothetical question, was hättest du gemacht, wenn du damals Priester gewesen wärst? Ralph answers, rather honestly, by admitting this to her. Ich hätte wahrscheinlich keine 95 Thesen geschrieben. Nun, Mia reacts with surprise to her husband's admission. Echt? She says, adding, du hättest einfach den Mund gehalten? To which Ralph replies with a sigh, leider, ich hätte zu viel Angst gehabt. Now, when someone admits something like this about themselves, when they're brave enough to say, na ja, wenn ich es gewesen wäre, hätte ich leider nichts gemacht, well, you'd think that the other person might judge them for their admitted cowardice, maybe even criticize them. That is, unless this person is your Lebensgefährten. And in fact, this is what we see with Mia. Instead of criticizing Ralph, she admits something herself. Mach dir keine Vorwürfe, she tells him. Ich weiß selber nicht, was ich gemacht hätte. The entire last part of their dialogue, from the point where Mia asks Ralph, was hättest du gemacht, wenn du damals Priester gewesen wärst? To Mia's own admission of, ich weiß selber nicht, was ich gemacht hätte. This entire stretch of conversation unfolds in the past tense subjunctive, because Mia and Ralph are talking about things that did not actually happen. Alles klar? What they're talking about instead are hypotheticals. That is, things that would or might have been. For example, what Ralph would have done if he had been a Catholic priest in the time of Martin Luther. And Ralph and Mia express these past tense hypotheticals by constructing their sentences just like the present perfect tense, except they use hätten and wären as helping verbs. Now, before we rejoin Ralph and Mia in Eastern Germany, let me show you just one more example of how the indicative and subjunctive moods work. Consider the following factual question that Mia poses to Ralph. Ralph, was hast du gemacht, als du heute Morgen 5 aufgestanden bist? Now, because Ralph really did get up at 5 a.m. and he did do something, Mia's factual question will elicit an equally factual response from Ralph. He'll say, ich bin joggen gegangen. Ralph really did get up at 5 a.m. and in fact, he went jogging, as I did this morning, or not. On the other hand, consider this same question from Mia, only expressed in hypothetical terms. Ralph, was hättest du gemacht, wenn du heute Morgen 5 aufgestanden wärst? Now, in this scenario, Ralph did not get up at 5 a.m. And so Ralph's response would be in the hypothetical, ich wäre joggen gegangen. In other words, Ralph claims that he would have gone jogging, as I would have this morning too. Does this make sense? Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, let's get back to our travels with the Grubers in Eastern Germany. Recall that their next Reiseziel is the federal capital city of Berlin. And here's the situation. Ralph and Mia are enjoying a wonderful tour of Berlin from a unique perspective, namely by boat on the Spree River. Die Spree, as it's called in German, runs roughly 400 kilometers across 3 states, Sachsen, Brandenburg, und Berlin. In fact, it runs right through the center of Berlin. Also dann, let's join Ralph and Mia now as they experience eine Spreefahrt durch Berlin.
Ist das nicht wunderschön? Diese Schifftour war eine tolle Idee.
Stimmt, das Wetter ist herrlich.
Schau mal, da vorne links. Das ist der Berliner Dom.
Sehr schön. Ist der alt?
Eigentlich nicht. Ich glaube, der ist aus dem 20. Jahrhundert.
Echt? Es ist nicht so alt.
Und siehst du das große Gebäude mit der Glaskuppel?
Ja,
Du weißt, was das ist, oder?
natürlich. Das ist unser Reichstagsgebäude. Ich würde gern die Glaskuppel besichtigen.
Es gibt sogar Treppen und man kann die Kuppel besteigen.
Toll.
Das werden wir beim nächsten Besuch tun.
Mensch, ist das nicht schön? Eine Bootstour von Berlin auf der Spree. Makes you want to go to Berlin in real life, doesn't it? And so, in the spirit of almost taking you to Berlin in real life, allow me to tell you about just a few of the many amazing things that you can see and do in Berlin. I've actually been there a couple times myself, and although I'm far from a Berlin-Experte, I can tell you this much. Berlin ist unglaublich. There's die Museumsinsel. It's an island in the Spree River that's home to a handful of museums and galleries. There are sprawling castles like the Schloss Charlottenburg, which dates to the 17th century and is the largest palace in Berlin. There are world-class theaters that offer a variety of plays, from classical pieces by German dramatists to more contemporary pieces written by international playwrights. There are renowned opera and symphony houses where you can hear some of the world's most talented singers and musicians perform soul-moving works from master composers. Then there's all the great food, ethnic and homegrown. For instance, there's the famous Currywurst, which was invented in Berlin. Now, Currywurst is pork sausage, which is steamed then fried, cut into fork-friendly chunks, and then, are you ready? Topped with curry ketchup and curry powder. So lecker. Besonders mit einem Bier. But even more than arts, entertainment, and food, today's Berlin is a city full of encounters with and reminders of Germany's turbulent past, especially of the 4 decades that Germany was politically and physically separated. Indeed, in Berlin, you'll find 2 museums dedicated to the memory of die Berliner Mauer, the Berlin Wall. There's the Wall Museum East Side Gallery, which is located on the eastern bank of the Spree, in the Friedrichshain neighborhood. And then there's das Mauermuseum am Haus Checkpoint Charlie, which is across the Spree River in the Kreuzberg neighborhood. The Wall Museum East Side Gallery is amazing. It's an entire warehouse building of paraphernalia, exhibits, staged rooms, multimedia presentations, and interactive displays, all of it with the goal of offering the visitor a true story look at German history from the end of World War II in 1945 to reunification in 1990. The Wall Museum East Side Gallery is also one of the few places where you can see what remains of die Berliner Mauer. There's about a mile of it, in fact, and it runs along the Mühlenstraße, parallel with the Spree River. Today it's called the East Side Gallery. And nowadays its reinforced concrete slabs serve as a palette for murals and street art. Here I am, standing in front of a section of the East Side Gallery back in, 2008 or so. By the way, if you happen to be particularly interested in the history of das geteilte Deutschland, another fascinating museum I'd recommend is das Stasi-Museum. The word Stasi is actually the shortened term that East Germans used for the Staatssicherheitsdienst, the state security service of the East German government. It was operated by das Ministerium für Staatssicherheit. Basically, die Stasi was the ministry's secret police and intelligence agency. And I will not mince words here. Die Stasi spied on, persecuted, and terrorized countless citizens of the Deutsche Demokratische Republik. And so today, there's a museum to remind people of those frightening times. Das Stasi-Museum is located in Bezirk Lichtenberg, which is actually within walking distance of the Wall Museum East Side Gallery. And now that I've brought up the topic of frightening and terrorizing times in Germany's past, there's one more site in Berlin that every visitor really should make time for, and that's das Holocaust-Mahnmal. This memorial is located in Berlin-Mitte, just across the way from das Brandenburger Tor, and right next to Berlin's biggest park, der Große Tiergarten. The memorial's official name, as established by the German federal government in 1999, is more historically accurate and poignant. Das Denkmal für die ermordeten Juden Europas. The memorial consists of more than 2,700 rectangular concrete slabs, varying in height and laid out like a massive maze across 19,000 square meters of open space. I first visited das Mahnmal in 2007. And I remember that I wandered among the slabs for nearly an hour. The further you venture into the concrete maze, the more uneasy the experience gets. You start to feel disoriented and lost among all those silent masses of concrete. The sounds from the city get drowned out. All you hear is yourself breathing and your thoughts. And all the while, you're still surrounded by these silent slabs. Das Erlebnis ist wirklich unbeschreiblich. It's really a powerful memorial. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, on this rather sober note, it's time to bring our lesson to a close. I hope that you enjoyed exploring Wittenberg and Berlin with Ralph and Mia. I hope that you've enjoyed learning more about the subjunctive mood and how the future tense works in German. In our next lesson, which, believe it or not, will be our final chapter in our journey through the German language, we're going to undertake one last language challenge. And we're going to do this by posing the following two-part question, namely, is our journey really coming to an end? Or is it just beginning? Auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich.